regardless of your personality, are honest, confident, collaborative, positive, passionate, focused, decisive, and empathetic. These are terms that have evolved over many years of research where employees have been surveyed across the world asking what they respond to the most and the best in terms of leadership. And it's these types of qualities. They respond to leaders who are honest, confident, collaborative, positive, passionate, those types of things. A lot of times we will start to think that to be a good leader, we have to be a type A personality or really outgoing and gregarious, that type. We have to be extroverted. But the reality is you can be a fairly reserved, introverted, quiet person and still be a very strong leader as long as you can acquire some of these characteristics. Like you can be confident and still be a quiet individual, and we'll talk about some of those things today. All right, well, I want to share this Joshua Tree Epiphany story as a way to kind of branch into what the focus is going to be for the course today. This is actually a story that comes from Robin Williams. She is a graphic designer and author of many books called the Non-Designer's Design series. Some of you may have heard of or used her books. But she has this great little story about when she was an adult living in the eastern United States, and she returns to her home as a child where she lived in California for 13 years of her childhood. She goes there to visit her parents and other family members during the Christmas holidays, and they are exchanging gifts. And one of her family members gives her a tree identification book. It's one of these books where you can open it up. It'll show you these different parts of a tree, and you can go out and explore and see if you can name and identify these trees. Well, she remembers opening up this book, and the first tree that she sees is a Joshua tree. And she remembers thinking, that's a very bizarre looking tree. I've never seen one of those trees before in my life. But it said it was native to her hometown there in California where she grew up. And again, she had lived there for 13 years as a child, as a teenager, up until her young adulthood before she moved to the eastern United States. She thought she'd never seen one of these trees before in her life. Well, out of curiosity, once everybody's done exchanging gifts, she decides to walk out and see if she can find one of these Joshua trees. And sure enough, to her great surprise, there is a Joshua tree in her front yard of the home where she grew up in. And on the cul-de-sac where she lived, 4 out of the 6 homes on that street had a Joshua tree on their front yard as well. Well, completely amazed and surprised by this, she decides to walk around her entire neighborhood, only to discover that 80% of the homes in her neighborhood where she grew up had a Joshua tree in her front yard, and yet she thought she had never seen one of these before in her life. So that's her big epiphany. She goes on to say, she writes this in a book about graphic design, and she says that many of us are not necessarily aware of the graphic design principles out there. We recognize when we see bad design, but we don't necessarily know how to fix it. But she says that once we can name something, and you can see her quote here, you're conscious of it, you have power over it, you're in control. And I want to apply this same principle to leadership and communication. We often recognize when we don't appreciate certain leadership styles. We can be frustrated about certain leaders. We also get frustrated about communication when we're not communicated too well. Yet when it comes to actually improving those in ourselves, becoming a better leader, becoming a better communicator, we don't always know how to fix it. And so we're going to talk about the principles of leadership and communication so that you can become conscious of those principles. You have power over it, and you'll become in control. And that is really what the focus of the course today is, to get those big picture concepts to be thinking about so that you can take ownership over your leadership and communication and start working towards improvement. Okay, so that's our quick introduction, just as a roadmap for where we'll head. So we've finished that first part. Step 1, we're going to define, describe, and dissect what leadership communication is. Sorry for a little typo right there. In step 2, we're going to move into recognizing the 6 styles of leadership. We'll walk through 6 different styles of leadership and their purposes. Then we're going to go through step 3, where you develop and utilize a leadership vision statement. And then in step 4, we're going to put all the first 3 steps together and to apply appropriate strategies in diverse scenarios. That's kind of where we're going to go. We're going to build on each step and kind of create this more holistic view of how to apply leadership and communication in different scenarios. So that's going to be the plan there. All right, so let's get this conversation rolling. Just again, you've already been jumping into that group chat, and that is fabulous. Let's start off with the question just to get us thinking about the challenges that we face as leaders. So take a moment and think about your role in leadership capacities. What are some of the greatest communication challenges that you face? I'd love to hear your thoughts in that group chat, and we'll kind of talk about that as kind of a springboard into the course. So if you want to go ahead and give me some of your thoughts here. What are some of the greatest communication challenges that you experience or face as a leader? And I'll give you a second. There's usually a delay as you're thinking about it, typing it, submitting it before I can actually see it come through in that group chat. I'll give you just a little bit there. And I'm seeing we're getting many more people joining in with the course. We've got a lot of people here today. That's fantastic. So, all right. So CR, I love this thought. Different generations, communication style. Yeah, this is something that's always been a challenge through the history of time. That there's a kind of a generational divide in the way we communicate. But we're seeing that a lot now. The sort of up and coming generation does have a very different way of speaking than those are kind of more advanced in their lives and careers today. And so, I see that. We see that a lot. And we see here, here's a similar but different challenge is the different cultures in the same working team. Yeah, so we're working very internationally these days, people coming from all over the world, different countries, different customs, different cultures. And that can bring in challenges when we're trying to communicate with each other, to work and collaborate when we don't understand exactly where someone's coming from in terms of culture and background. So, JT, you mentioned strategic direction, the change in strategic direction and reaction to that change. Yeah, a lot of change management is a big part of leadership, especially as we see a lot of evolution, particularly in the field of, all fields are changing and evolving, of course, but in the tech industry, that's particularly challenging, as there's a lot of movement and change and takeovers and mergers and acquisitions and things like that. So AQ, you mentioned when not to talk. LC, you mentioned different culture. We're seeing a lot of great things. Language barriers. You can see this list here. Fostering two-way engagement. I like that. Getting the communication style correct for high-powered stakeholders. Okay, yeah. Age gap, negative employee. Negative employees can be challenging for sure. Knowing how transparent to be. You'll see here, and I'm not going to walk through everything, but as I scroll through this group chat, and you can all see it on your own screens as well, there's a lot of challenges. Communication is not easy, and it impacts every aspect of what we do in the workplace. As leaders, we have kind of a responsibility to manage that communication in ways that you might not necessarily have to as much as a typical employee that's not in a leadership role. We have a responsibility to control it, to organize it, to focus it, and to work in different types of scenarios, and to adjust and adapt to different people and situations. So there's a lot going on here, but I like to get this list out here in the chat so we can see the different challenges that people face. We can recognize and be very open about the fact that it's not easy. I think it's important to acknowledge that because a lot of times we get frustrated about bad communication in the workplace, but we don't always acknowledge that it's not very easy sometimes to overcome. But again, if we're conscious of some of the things that we can do right away, we can start making communication a little bit better. All right, well, let's start with step one. We're going to define, describe, and dissect leadership communication. I do appreciate all of the thoughts in that group chat. Please keep them coming. And if you have thoughts or questions as we go through the material, please feel free to just pop in there at any moment that you would like. All right, so we're going to talk about three quick stories to get us thinking about different types of ways to think about communication. We're going to talk about some leadership facts. We're going to define it, and then we're going to walk through 4 focuses of communication: written, visual, nonverbal, and spoken communication. So we'll move into that. So 3 quick stories. We're going to start with the grocery list fail there. That's that blank white square there on the left. Just going to tell a quick story. This is just kind of a humorous story about a husband and wife that are home on a Saturday, and the husband is getting ready to go to a football game with some friends while the wife is at home preparing for a party that they're going to be hosting that night in their home. Well, as the husband's about to leave, he for the football game, his wife asked if he wouldn't mind going to the grocery store real quick and getting a few things for their party that night. before he goes to the game. And he says, sure thing, would love to grab some things. What do you need? If you don't mind, though, please just make it a quick list. I don't want to be late for the game. And she says, sure thing. And she puts down this list and she writes 7 quick things for him to go get at the grocery store. Well, he is gone longer than she expects. She knows that he was worried about being late for the game, so she's just about to call him and see where he's at before he comes running through the door, and he drops 3 bags of groceries on the counter, and he says, I'll be back for another load, and he runs back out the door. Well, she's a little confused. She's thinking, I only asked for 7 things. They should have all fit in one bag. Not really sure what he bought. So she starts digging through the bags, and she realizes she sees in the first bag there's a pound of butter, there's 2 bags of sugar, and there's 3 bottles of vanilla. And she's thinking, okay, well, I did ask for these things, but he's buying more than I asked for. Well, he comes back in the house again, drops 2 more large bags of groceries on the counter, and runs back out to the car for another load. And now she's even more confused. So she digs through the 4th bag, and she sees 4 dozen eggs. And then in the 5th bag finds 5 tubs of lard. And then she finds the grocery list that she had handed to him. And I'm going to click here. You can see now on the screen, this is the list that she handed to him. And then she starts to recognize where the problem is. Well, her husband comes in a few more times with 6 bags of flour, and then a few more times after that with 7 large cartons of milk, before finally running out to go to the football game. And she's standing there looking at all of these groceries, which has far more than she anticipated. You can see here there's a subtle nuance in the communication, but what went wrong here? What did she do maybe in the grocery list that was confusing, that caused a communication problem? But maybe even the bigger question is who is to blame? Is it the husband or the wife here for this miscommunication? Any thoughts there? What went wrong, and who would you blame? Any thoughts here? Not that we always have to blame somebody, but it's a good kind of way to be thinking about the problem. All right, she numbered the list. Okay, I see that right here. She created an ordered list. So again, it might seem a subtle thing. She created numbers when numbers maybe didn't need to be there. Both are to blame. See how you're saying, okay, there's bullets in the list. They don't speak clearly. Yeah, so if she had made them bullets, not numbers, that would have solved the problem. Had she even put a period or a full stop after each one of those numbers, probably would have solved the problem. But yeah, we don't actually need to number those things. So a lack of shared understanding, too many assumptions there. I like that. There's assumptions going on. The husband should have known better. At least could have called her. Okay, so it's the husband's fault. You know, this is silly. Why would we need 7 cartons of milk? He should have called her. Okay. It's good it wasn't a 20-item list. Yeah, that's a funny comment there. Yeah, if we had kept going, we could have had all kinds of stuff. So, all right, her responsibility first. The numbers were confusing to start. His responsibility to validate. Okay. Yeah, and so we can go back and forth. And really, the fault in this particular scenario doesn't matter so much. What I want to talk about is kind of the big picture issue. Let's assume the wife in this case is the leader, and she creates a communication to her employee or her subordinate, which in this case is the husband, gives him this list, and he just sort of takes it at face value, doesn't take the time to ask her whether or not this is what she actually needs, and we end up having a miscommunication problem. Well, as a leader, we need to be conscious of these things. We need to be conscious of the details and the nuances, and recognize that if something goes wrong, we should just take ownership of it and say, okay, my fault. Yes, our employees have a responsibility to pay close attention to messages. They should follow up if they're confused. But if something goes wrong, we need to take ownership over that and recognize that sometimes it's the nuances that cause big problems. And so we need to make sure things are clear. We need to pay attention to our communication. And then when things don't go wrong, don't just get frustrated at our employees. Sometimes we can be frustrated, for example, if we send out an email and then nobody reads it, or only half of our employees read it, or they only read part of it. Well, if they're only reading part of our email or they're not reading it at all, might there be something that we can do better to make them read it? Or maybe email's the wrong channel. We shouldn't even be using email at all. Maybe we should do a quick phone call or a Zoom call or something like that instead. But again, trying to take ownership over the message is important as a leader. All right, so thanks for your thoughts there. Let's go ahead and move into this, this second story here. This is the brash ulcer guy. This is a true story about a man named Barry Marshall, and that's his photo there on the screen. Barry Marshall, in the early 1980s, so this is a while ago now, was a young researcher, just finished his master's degree in gastroenterology, and he was new to the field and was working in a research space, studying different gastroenterology challenges and working on doing some clinical trials with patients who would come in with different types of stomach ulcer symptoms. Now, in the field of gastroenterology in the early 1980s, it was widely believed that stomach ulcers were only caused by psychological problems. So stress or anxiety or depression, those were the things that were causing stomach ulcers, and you could not treat them with a typical antibiotic or some kind of medication like that. You couldn't just take, some kind of a pill and it would solve the problem, because it wasn't believed that it was a bacteria that was causing stomach ulcers. Well, he was doing these clinical trials, and he discovered something really valuable. He realized that most of his patients that were coming in with stomach ulcers had a bacteria called Helicobacter pylori, or H. pylori, it's often called. And this was a big finding. He was like, most patients that are coming in here have this bacteria. This suggests that we can actually treat most stomach ulcers with some kind of medication. This was a huge discovery for the field of gastroenterology, a huge discovery for patients who suffer from stomach ulcers, but also a huge discovery for the pharmaceutical industry, who could now start creating medication and market them to people with stomach ulcers. So even companies that create things like Pepto-Bismol, this was a huge finding for them. Well, he's very excited. He goes to an international conference to share his research findings. Now, he's, again, a young, not well-known scientist, a medical professional, and he is speaking in front of a lot of expert, well-trained, seasoned experts in gastroenterology. And in his excitement, he makes this statement in his presentation. He says, H. pylori is the cause of all stomach ulcer disease, and chronic ulcer recurrence can be eradicated in all patients. Okay, so that statement did not set well with his colleagues there, and in fact, they quickly brushed him off as not being really aware of the field, and they didn't really latch onto his research very quickly. What was it in that statement that you think may have bothered his particular audience? I'm going to say this one more time. H. pylori is the cause of all stomach ulcer disease, and chronic ulcer recurrence can be eradicated in all patients. Any thoughts there on what he said that might have not resonated well with his particular audience? And it might seem like a subtle thing, but it really made him lose credibility there. And AO, MCA both mentioned the word all. Too many alls. Yeah, he used the word eradicate. All. It is the cause of all stomach ulcer in all patients. Okay, this is what we call absolute language, and it's generalized. Yeah, BB. So when we're talking to scientists, medical professionals, as many of you know, we don't talk in absolutes typically in science. We need to hedge those comments, like saying words like most or many, or this is a big factor. There are a lot of limitations to his study. These were only clinical trials, and he was jumping to conclusions way too quickly. Okay, so that didn't resonate well. Well, it got him very frustrated. In fact, he was so upset by this that they weren't really listening to his research that he went back to his clinic and decided he was going to prove the entire field wrong. He created a concoction of H. pylori, put it in a petri dish, and drank it. Made himself very, very sick, got a serious stomach ulcer, and then he went and found some medication and treated it. Got some antibiotics and treated the medication, and sure enough, he cured himself. And he was sure that this was going to be proof that he was right and everybody else was wrong. Well, as you might imagine, that action did not help his cause. In fact, if you research his name and you research the story of Barry Marshall, you'll find that for a while he was labeled a mad scientist. He was crazy. He was dangerous. He needed to be kicked out of the field. He was largely disregarded, and his research people didn't take it serious for many years. In fact, it took about 10 years for people in the field of gastroenterology to start really taking some of his research serious, because he had built such a bad reputation doing some of those things that were non-traditional in the field of medicine and science. But after about 10 years, people did start looking at some of research. He started gaining some credibility. And in fact, 20 years after this incident in the early 2000s, Barry Marshall ended up getting the Nobel Prize in Medicine for his discovery. The sad thing about this story is that he was right, or at least mostly right, that in fact many ulcers are caused by some kind of bacteria that can be treated. So this was a huge finding. He did eventually get recognition for it, but it took so long for him to rebuild his reputation to gain that credibility back. So again, I use this story as a thought as we think about us as leaders. We also build and lose credibility very quickly. In fact, it can take years to build up a strong reputation as a leader, and we can lose it almost instantly by saying the wrong thing at the wrong time. We need to be careful. We need to be conscious of what we're saying. We need to be conscious of our audience. Now, that might be a little stressful for some of you to think about, but just be aware of who your audience is. Be aware of what you're saying. Be more in control of what you're presenting to your audience, and recognize even the nuances can sometimes turn our entire audiences off. All right, so the third story, I'll be very quick on this. This is the story of Jim Farley. He was a top executive of Ford Motor Company, and back in 2007, he was delivering a presentation at the Consumer Electronics Show in Las Vegas. At the time, this was when GPS technology was relatively new in vehicles. And he was really, really excited about all this new technology that they were integrating into Ford vehicles. And so at the Consumer Electronics Show, he had a script prepared, a presentation, but he gets a little bit off script. And in his excitement, he makes this comment. He says, quote, "We know everyone who breaks the law. We know when you're doing it. We have GPS in your car, so we know what you're doing." He said it as a joke. He was trying to be funny. He's like, "Yeah, we've got GPS in your car. We know when you're breaking the law." Well, that comment did not set well. It of course, exploded on social media. It was quickly spread through the news that Ford was monitoring our every move, that they had technology that they were turning into the police and the government, which wasn't actually accurate. And Ford did have to come back and say, "We don't actually track what people do. We don't actually care what you do. We're not here to monitor your driving habits." But, the damage had been done, and he created a little bit of a public relations mess for Ford there for a short period. Again, sometimes as leaders, we have to stay on script. There are times where we're delivering important messages, whether it be to customers or to employees, especially, we're talking a little bit earlier briefly about like change in the workplace. And when there's large-scale change or things like layoffs or mergers or acquisitions or anything that's kind of pressing, or even, we're sort of emerging out of a pandemic right now. There were times when leaders had to give announcements about safety protocol. When we're talking about important events or moments, we need to stay on script to make sure we're not saying things that can get us in trouble or put our company in a bad light. So I collectively use these three stories to get us thinking about, we need to pay attention to the nuance. We need to understand our audience. We need to stay on script. We need to really be in control of that message. All right, well, with that in mind, let's go ahead and look at this diagram. If you've ever taken a course in college or possibly high school on human communication, you've probably seen something like this. This is what we call the communication feedback loop, where when we communicate something, we are the sender, they're on the left, and the person we are communicating to, or the people we are communicating to, is the receiver, they're on the far right. Every time we create a message, whether it's a verbal message, a spoken message, or a written message, we encode that message. And you see that there in that second rectangle. Encoding the message is the way we frame the message. So when the wife created the grocery list, she encoded it by putting numbers and didn't put periods after the numbers. And so that's the encoding process. The words we use, the punctuation we use, the colors we use, anything that's related to communication, that's the encoding process. Then on the right side, the receiver decodes that message. That's the way they interpret the message. So in the case of the husband and wife, the husband saw the numbers as meaning quantity. He felt like that must mean that that's how many she wanted. He put his own personal experience and background into that interpretation, and that's what came out. That's how he decoded the message. The medium, of course, there is just the tool in which we're sending it. So if it's a spoken message, that's it. If it's a grocery list, it's a piece of paper. If it's a website, then it's the web page, right? Those are the mediums. And then the feedback. The feedback is when we recognize whether or not the communication worked. So when the husband shows up with 7 cartons of milk, that's the feedback. It didn't work. When Barry Marshall and his audience doesn't trust or doesn't follow his research, that's the feedback. When they call him a mad scientist, that's the feedback. When Jim Farley creates a public relations disaster and people start saying that Ford is following or removed, that's the feedback. Those diagonal lines in between there is what we call noise. And noise is the challenge. Noise is what gets in the way of communication. Many of you earlier mentioned some of the greatest challenges that you face when it comes to communication. And you put language barriers, generational divides. We can talk about things like culture, but also gender. And the things that get in the way, if men are talking to women or women are talking to men, there are some things that are just not going to resonate well, or that might be offensive, or might impact someone's ability to really respond to the correct message. So we have to be in control of that noise, but be aware of that, aware of the generational differences, be aware of the gender divide or the gender differences, be aware of cultural differences, be aware of our employees' background, education, and knowledge. And as we get feedback, we get better at this. We realize something's not resonating or not working right. What's the noise that's getting in the way of that, and can we fix that? Is it a simple thing like punctuation, or is it something more complex like gender or age or something like that? So you'll see this thought here. As a leader, you have an obligation to understand how the communication process works, then learn how to control the noise. All right. With all those thoughts in mind, I'm just going to give you a few facts and figures about leadership and communications, communication in particular, but these are closely related. So I'm going to just go from column to column here, left to right, if you just want to follow along. You'll see here on the left, when employees understand their overall role in the business, 91% will work towards success. But if they don't, that number drops to 23%. This comes from research firm Malcolm. This idea being that if employees really understand the big picture, that is being communicated to them well, and they know how their specific task fits in the big picture of it all, they will be more inclined to work towards the success of the company. They want to see the company grow and succeed. But if they don't really understand that, if that's not been communicated to them well, sure, they'll come in, they'll do their job, and they'll go home. But they're not necessarily giving their full attention to their job or to the growth or the benefit of the company. Communication to employees about how they fit into the big picture actually makes companies run better. It improves culture. It improves an employee's satisfaction in the workplace. Second column there, companies that have highly effective internal communication, and that's communication that is between leaders and employees. It's like email, memos, things that are sent between employees, chats, Zoom, conferences. They have a better, higher total returns to shareholders. So if you have good, strong communication processes, if people understand chains of command, if they understand how to get messages to the right people at the right time, businesses make more money. It's a known fact that if you communicate well, your company works better and you end up making more money. So it helps with efficiency. You see, $26,000 is the cumulative cost per worker per year. So $26,000 in the United States is about the half of the average salary. So you could say the average salary in the United States for professionals is about $50,000. This varies a lot depending on where you live, of course. But half the salary of the average worker is the cost due to productivity losses resulting from communication barriers. And communication barriers happen in a lot of different ways, whether that's a language barrier or a generation barrier or even a technology barrier. Some people have access to the right tools that they need. They'll see the information that's important to them. So, all right, the fourth column there, a business with 100 employees spends an average downtime of 17 hours per week clarifying communication, which for a relatively small business is about $500,000 a year in expenditure. So obviously it's not a bad thing to clarify communication, but if we have to keep clarifying, if we can't get things clear enough, quick enough, we start losing a lot of time and productivity because of a lack of communication or communication problems. And the last one I think is kind of the big one. The 71% of employees feel that managers do not spend enough time explaining goals and plans. So if you think of yourself as a leader and you think about how 71% of employees feel like they're not being communicated enough, it's kind of an introspective question. Am I communicating enough to my employees? Are they part of the 71% that actually feels this way? Many employees don't feel like they're getting enough communication. We're talking about 3 out of almost every 4 employees feel like they're not getting enough communication. So do we really talk about goals, plans, about what they're doing well, what they're not doing well? Are we communicating to them enough? So some interesting facts to be thinking about, but you can see how these types of things impact productivity, they impact culture, they impact how well an employee works, they impact their frustration levels, and to some degree, this also impacts turnover rates. Employees are more likely to leave if they feel frustrated if they're not getting good communication. So we want to keep that all in mind. So I'm giving just kind of a lot of introductory level things to be thinking about here, and then we'll get into the specific focuses and leadership styles here in a bit. But this study comes from the Harvard Business Review. They surveyed thousands of employees in many different countries, asking them what leadership skills are needed the most in the workplace. And you'll see here there's a list of things that came up as kind of the top 15 things that businesses need in their leaders. And I added those red arrows next to the ones that are related to communication. So inspiring and motivating others, displaying integrity, communicating powerfully, collaborating and promoting teamwork, building relationships, displaying expertise, displaying a strategic perspective. All of those things are related to communication. You can see here that strong leaders are strong communicators. They just go hand in hand. So we want to be those strong leaders. All right, I'm going to give you a couple of good thoughts here from experts in leadership. This comes from Alan Axelrod. He's he's the author of Elizabeth First CEO, Strategic Lessons from the Leader Who Built an Empire. But he says this, quote, effective leadership is still largely a matter of communication. An effective leader thinks about what he or she says, carefully crafting each utterance of any significance. Good leaders carefully craft their messages. They're thoughtful about it. You're thinking about how you're going to frame it. Anything that actually has some significance. You know, I granted, not every email you send, not every conversation you have is going to have a lot of significance. But whenever it does, whenever something matters, you have to carefully craft those messages. A second thought, this comes from Deborah Barrett. She is the author of a college textbook called Leadership Communication. She says this, leadership communication is the controlled, purposeful transfer of meaning by which individuals influence a single group, person, organization, or community. Leadership communication requires the full range of communication abilities and resources to connect positively to audiences, overcome interferences, and create and deliver messages that guide, direct, motivate, or inspire others. But I've highlighted and read a couple of the thoughts there. It's controlled and purposeful, similar to what Alan Axelrod was saying. But then also, this is interesting, the full range of communication abilities. That's an interesting way of framing that. When we lead, we have a lot of different options, and particularly in today's age, we have a lot of different tools and technologies. We have, online chats. We have, Zoom or Microsoft Teams or any other sort of virtual platform. We've got in-person meetings, presentations, slide decks, phone calls. There's a lot of different ways to communicate. But in addition to all of that, we have different words we can use, different ways of framing messages, organizational structure. The full range of communication abilities means to be thinking about all of those things holistically. What do we have at our disposal, and what is the best option for these employees in this moment with this scenario? So using that full range. I'm going to take that thought and take us back a couple thousand years to the time of Aristotle, when he says something very similar. He says rhetoric is, quote, the faculty of observing in any given case the available means of persuasion, being aware of what's available to us in order to persuade and motivate others to act. We are using our available means as leaders. So I'm going to create my own leadership communication definition by kind of merging these thoughts with Aristotle's thoughts. And the leadership communication then is the faculty of observing and applying in any given case the available communication options in order to guide, direct, motivate, or inspire. So that's what we're trying to do, use our full range of communication abilities. All right, so with those thoughts, I'm going to jump into some of those full range. We're going to talk about 4 different focuses. These are kind of 4 general areas in which we communicate as leaders. And I'm just going to walk through kind of a list of things to be thinking about in terms of the the range of communication options. As I go through these, I'm going to encourage you to maybe jot down things that, or maybe you hadn't thought much about, or that you have questions about, or maybe that you feel like you could improve upon. And then we'll have a discussion question here in just a few minutes. So we're going to go through these 4 focuses: the written, oral, visual, and nonverbal communication, and kind of think through some things to be thinking about and how that affects leadership. So some of these will feel kind of common and obvious, but again, being aware of the full range and thinking about the nuances in our communication is kind of a good starting point. After we get through these 4 focuses, it'll be close to our break. We might start into the leadership styles next before the break. We'll have a discussion, and then we'll move into the leadership styles in the second hour, where we get very specific about how to improve in different types of scenarios. Okay, all right. So if you want to jot those down, and if you have questions about any of these throughout, certainly jot them into that group chat at any moment, and we can talk about them throughout as well. You don't need to wait until the discussion question. Okay, so first is our written communication. Probably in many ways the way we communicate the most, because email is such a big part of our lives as leaders. In fact, this is constantly evolving and changing. But the last research that I read about this is that the average leader receives about 50 to 70 emails per day. And I don't know if that fits your life or what you see in the workplace, but we're getting a lot of emails. You don't necessarily respond to all of those, but many of them you do. And again, research is showing that most managers spend at least half their workday, 4 to 5 hours a day, reading and responding to email. So written communication is a big part of what we do. Thus, we need to be very conscious of the way we write. A few things to note. First of all, the subject line. Why does that matter, the subject line? It should be descriptive. It should use verbs, not just noun phrases. And it's usually longer than 1 or 2 words. So if you're writing subject lines that say things like Friday or meeting or document or report, that's not a good subject line. It doesn't help people to know what's in it. And if they need to research that message later, if they need to find old information when it's been archived in their email, it's better if it has a strong subject line. So again, trying to improve efficiency in the workplace, if you give really valuable information in an email and you need people to access it later, a better subject line is going to help people, first of all, open it in the first place, but then also find it later. So instead of just saying meeting or Friday, you can say bring report to meeting on Friday. Okay, that way there's an action in there. We've got the verb bring. You're telling people what to do in the meeting. We have kind of the basic gist of the email right there in the subject line. 5-6 word subject lines are actually good. Now, if you start getting longer than that, if you start writing 9-10 words, subject lines, they don't always fit on the screen, and so people can't see that. But again, usually longer than 1 or 2 words, about 4, 5, 6 words is going to be a good subject line, using an action verb and not just noun phrases. Okay. All right, salutation, appropriate level of professionalism. So this varies a lot between industry and company, but generally speaking, if you don't know a person or you don't know them well, for example, if you're hiring somebody that you have not really gotten to know that well, or if you're talking to a customer or client, remember that you as a leader represent the tone of the company. And it's usually considered best practice if you use their title, if they have a title like Reverend or Doctor or whatever their title might be. We do need to be conscious and careful of gender-specific titles if we don't know what their gender is. So using words like Mr. and Mrs. Mrs. is particularly problematic because drawing attention to marital status is usually not needed. In fact, it's hardly ever needed, and so using Mrs. is not usually a great thing. So use their title, maybe their full name, not just their first name. It's a little bit too casual. Again, if you don't know them well. However, if you do know them well, if they're a coworker of yours, an employee that you work with daily, just saying hi John or whatever, or hey Stephanie, that's fine too if it's a more informal setting. But recognize that the level of formality does matter as a leader, and you want to be appropriate for the right situation. All right, design and format. This doesn't feel like a written thing, but recognize that when you write lengthy, dense paragraphs, people are less likely to read them. So there's been a lot of research on what people are willing to engage in. And if you write, a lengthy paragraph that's like 20 lines long and it's all stuck together, you've got important data and information, much will likely be lost. We live in a world where people are very distracted by information. And so you want to organize your information in a way that encourages reading and helps people find what the important stuff. So spacing out paragraphs, not writing paragraphs longer than about 4 or 5 lines before you add that space. Adding in bullets or numbered lists can really help draw attention to what matters. So be thinking about how you can organize your information in a way that encourages reading. In fact, I just out of curiosity, I'll have you jump into the group chat. How many tabs do you have open on your screen right now? Likely many of you are already toggling between me and other tasks, looking at your email, checking other news, social media perhaps. Whatever it is you've got going on at work, you probably have multiple things going on. Remember that your employees are facing that same challenge. They're being distracted by many different things. But I know on my computer right now, I have about 20 tabs open. Envy, you've got 24, seeing 3, 4, 10, 20, 11, 18. All right, so there's a range. 3 and 4 is definitely on the smaller side. I'm seeing DN, you've got 50-ish plus tabs. And of course, now that things like Google Chrome lets us create, you can sort of group your tabs. You can put hundreds, and I'm seeing, let's see, you got about 200 tabs. Well, we have to recognize that this is the world we live in, and even though we get frustrated when people don't read all of our messages, it's because they're overwhelmed with information. And we have to make sure that we're communicating the right information at the right time. We're not giving them too much, only give them what they need and make it easy on them. And they're more likely to read it and pay attention to it. So, and we can see just from this quick response here in the group chat, how distracted we really are in this world. So recognize that you might have to find different communication channels to really get the attention of people. For example, an email out to 100 people may not work as well as a Zoom meeting to the 100 people. Just even if it's a 5-minute Zoom meeting or 10 minutes, that might work better than an email. So, being conscious of that. Okay, just a few other things about written communication. The tone, people do like to be spoken to in conversational tone. Speak to people like they're human beings. So, try to avoid a lot of heavy jargon, a lot of robotic phrasing. Really speak to people like you would in a conversation. Plain language, you may or may not have heard of this term, but speaking in plain language, using familiar words and acronyms is usually good. It depends on your audience, of course. All right, respect and fairness. We need to use bias-free, gendered-free language. We use it particularly in English, and of course, I'm most familiar with English because that's my native language. But we have a lot of terms that we use that have been gendered over the years, like salesman, or even the word guys can sometimes marginalize or separate people who do not identify as guys. I know that's a challenge, especially for those of you who, use guys on a regular basis as kind of a generic, hey, everybody. But recognize that not everybody does identify as a guy, and so that can sometimes make people feel excluded. But especially words like salesman, or words that have been gendered like stewardess. We should be using phrase like salespeople, flight attendant instead of stewardess. A lot of industries have gotten rid of terms like actress and waitress and have turned them into server and actor. That are more gender neutral. So be very conscious of that. As a leader, you do have a responsibility to make sure everybody feels included. You're going to get the best work out of people. You're going to create the best culture if you're very conscious of your terminology. So being conscious of those things can make a big deal. RK, folks I would agree that folks is a better term. It's gender neutral. It includes everybody, and it's easy to say. I think we use guys because it's easy, but folks is easy to say too. So let's just kind of create that culture of using words that where everybody can feel included. All right, yeah, thanks for those thoughts there. Let's see. Being clear, organizational structure matters. Sentence structure, if you haven't thought about that, the way you write does impact the way people interpret your credibility. That may not seem fair, because if you're very talented, very smart, very educated, but you don't write all that well, unfortunately, people interpret your writing ability as your competence. It's just kind of an unfortunate way that people often think. If you can improve your writing, you're writing through, you can write with complex sentence structures, you're using your punctuation and grammar correctly, it does tend to elevate the way people perceive you as a leader. Again, not totally fair, because again, you can be a very good leader, you can be very smart, intelligent, capable, and not write well. Writing's not everybody's strength, but people do tend to perceive poor writing with poor leadership. It's just bad communication. It also creates challenges if people can't understand the message because there's some grammatical problems and things like that. So something to think about. And then grammar, punctuation, spelling mechanics, same issue there. So again, if you jotted down anything that you hadn't thought much about that you feel like you can improve upon, maybe write that down. I'm going to move through the next few a little bit quicker. Oral communication, a few different things to be thinking about. First of all, audience adaptation. You kind of set the mood as a leader. When you kind of walk into a room, people respond to the way you are. So be thinking about that, adjust to the situation and to the people accordingly. You can control that mood. Fairness. Give consistent feedback, reproach, praise, and instruction to all employees. Recognize that if you start, even the appearance of favoritism can really damage a culture within a workplace. As a leader, you need to make sure if you're giving constructive feedback that you do that to everybody. If you have, employee evaluations on a regular basis, do that with everybody. If you're taking people out to lunch, make sure you take everybody out to lunch. Not necessarily all at the same time, but take turns, go around. But if you're just sort of excluding people and including others, that can sort of start to damage the culture. You have a responsibility to be fair and to treat employees all with respect and with the same kind of treatment. Language, again, avoid speaking in gendered or biased, but also offensive language. As a leader, people don't respond well to you if you're offensive. Now, if you're just an average employee and you're not leading a team, people don't tend to be as bothered by curse words or other things. But once you become a leader, you represent the company, you represent the workplace, you kind of create that culture. We don't want things like sexist language. We don't want things like, we don't want that anyway, but especially as a leader, we don't want religious offensive terms. You have to be very conscious of who you have around you and make sure your language is appropriate. Awareness. I love this thought. You may have heard about this term. It's called manage by walking around. This is an old thought that's been developed for many years. It really became famous by J.W. Marriott. He did not invent the term and the phrase, but he kind of implemented this plan in his work life. So Marriott is the one who created the Marriott hotel chain. But it's this idea of not siloing yourself as a leader, but actually being involved in their lives, walking around the workspace, seeing your employees, talking to them, just sort of generally asking how they're doing. This doesn't mean to micromanage, and it's not like you're trying to control what's happening. It's just being aware, giving people a space to talk about what's happening, recognizing where the issues are, recognize the pain points. People want to be able to feel like they have a voice, and you just walking around helps. Now, I often get this question, but a lot of our work is virtual these days. How do I walk around in a virtual space? And you're right, it is more challenging. But one of the things that Marriott did, he had hotels all over the world. Obviously, he couldn't just walk around all the time, but he did fly to those places. He would visit locations. Now, that may not be feasible for you to go visit places, but you can now use tools like Zoom or Teams or other virtual spaces and just do an occasional call. Again, not to micromanage, but to just say, hey, just checking in. Do you have any questions? Are you experiencing any problems? Anything I can help with? And then just sort of have a quick conversation. I like the idea of a video call, just so you can see each other's faces and chat once in a while. But if you can do that, schedule some time each week to talk to different employees and be aware. And that really, really improves the communication, kind of reduces frustration amongst employees. So, okay. Yeah, not to be confused with drive-by management. I agree. It's a different process. But yeah, the idea is just being aware and being involved, rather than just being stuck in your cubicle or your office all day. You're out and about, and you're making people feel heard and connected. Clarifying roles, making sure that people know their role within the larger company. Again, going back to those statistics earlier, employees do better if they understand how they fit into the big picture. Employee performance, regular and consistent employee performance is helpful. Employees actually expect that and want that. If they go a really long time, a year, 2 years, 3 years, 5 years, and they've never gotten feedback from an employee, a lot of times they wonder if they're appreciated. They wonder if they're doing a good job. But also they like to improve. People like to grow. Growth is an important part of feeling like your job is meaningful. And so you want to learn where you can improve. And most employees respond well to being told how to get better and how to grow within the company. Also, expressing gratitude is important. Now, you don't want to lay constant praise because that can sometimes create complacency in the workplace. But gratitude is important. People do want to know that you are recognizing the good work that they're doing. And then also goals and objectives, regularly explaining those. So that's all kind of oral communication. You can do some of this written, but I encourage most of this to come through kind of a face-to-face or virtual live synchronous type conversation. All right, let's kind of look at a couple others. The visual communication, this might be an area you haven't thought much about, but this goes back to trying to make information as accessible and quick to read as possible. We want to simplify people's lives, and visual communication can often do that. So be thinking about how to make your content more readable, which is often short paragraphs, chunked information, highlighting key points and using headings, using images and graphics. So, sometimes you can say a lot with a very quick picture. We live in a world that makes that very easy. You can take a photo with your cell phone and email that to somebody. You can draw on a napkin, take a photo of that and send that. We can draw pictures. We can take photos. We can share graphics. We can create very quick smart art or other diagrams using tools like PowerPoint or Word or even Excel for data visualization. So think about what's going to be the most impactful with the least amount of effort. Sometimes it requires more effort on your part, but the communication is better for your employees, your clients, your customers, whatever. So layout can matter, especially if you're sending out lengthier like reports. If you need people to read reports, they should be visually enticing. It's an interesting, as an anecdote experience, I worked with the Utah State Legislature on a challenge they were facing where the legislators and those who make the laws were not reading the reports by the auditors. They'd spend a year doing all this research to help inform legislators, but they found they weren't reading the reports because they were too long, too dense, too boring. And they came to me and asked me, what can we do to fix this problem? And so we just have to design it better. You can leave the content there, but if you add headings, add pictures, separate the paragraphs, put columns so you can add highlights and key points, you're going to get better engagement. And sure enough, they did that. They created summary reports and visuals. They adjusted the layout. Now people are reading the material that they've created. But again, we're so inundated with information, you have to make it easier to digest and ingest. So typefaces matter. You don't want to use bad fonts like Comic Sans. And yes, I'm going to say Comic Sans is a bad font for most professional settings. I know some have read that it's good for things like accessibility, but the reality is there's a lot of good fonts for accessibility. Comic Sans is just usually less professional. Looks kind of childish. So be careful of all that. Be very conscious of your visual communication. I'm going to show you just a quick example here. Looking at the document there on the far left, I made the text so small that you can't read it intentionally so that you can focus just on the visual here. But look at that original document there on the far left. Research suggests that people are far less likely to read that document on the far left than they are than the one on the far right. Even though the one on the far right will probably take 2 pages to write rather than 1, people are more likely to read it because it's more visually accessible. We've got larger margins, white space, headings, text, visuals. So you can see here to go from the original there on the left to the one on the far right, we can just do a few things. Add some space between your paragraphs, remove the indents, what actually looks like visual noise, remove 2 contrast use two contrasting fonts, one for your headings, one for your fonts. Shorten your line length so that you've got wider margins that people tend to read better if they can move to the next line quicker. And then increase space between the lines, and then add pictures and subheadings again, and also highlighting techniques. If you're going to send an email, for example, you might make an important date big, bold, and purple so that people will see it, or red or something like that. So, but yeah, thanks, Cage, for putting that resource there in there. But people are more likely to read your messages if you are visually conscious of what you're doing there. Last, I'm just going to mention nonverbal communication. So a few things to be conscious of. Now, these do vary, again, a little bit between industry, especially things like dress. The way you dress does impact the way people perceive you. A lot of times employees like to see that their leader looks like a leader. So if you're a very casual industry and everybody wears shorts and flip-flops, you might just wear pants and tennis shoes, which is maybe a slight step up from where your employees are dressing. But be thinking about that. Recognize that if you're dressing down all the time, you don't often look like the leader that people expect you to be, and that can impact people viscerally. In other words, they have kind of an emotional response to the way you look. It does help to dress up a little bit. Now, you don't want to dress to the point where you're ridiculously overdressed. If your industry doesn't wear suits and ties, then that's probably not the right thing to wear. But you do want to look like the leader in the room. Empathy, so making people feel understood and heard, giving expressions like facial expressions, like you're looking into their eyes, you're nodding, acknowledging them, making that eye contact. Also, your posture can make a big difference. You'll see I've written in here, maintain confident leadership, posture, position, and power poses. So power poses, I'm going to write this person's name, Amy Cuddy. She has several great TED Talks, a few books. She also has a blog. Amy Cuddy she's a social psychologist and has done a lot of research on posture, and has found that if you just stand tall, lift your shoulders, and move your hands out, you will actually feel more confident. So if you are more of an introverted, reserved leader, you find yourself feeling timid a lot, changing your posture can actually help you feel more confident. But on the flip side, when you have good, strong posture and you look confident to employees, you tend to look more trustworthy. You're also more likely to be persuasive. People are more likely to listen to you and follow your advice or your policies or whatever you need them to do. If you look confident, they're less likely to push back on that. So be authentic as much as you can, and then also inspire through action, not just words. Employees tend to like leaders who act and do as they say, not just demand all the time, but actually act according to what they're asking. So, all right, so those are the kind of the four focuses: written, visual, oral, and nonverbal communication. Wondering if you wrote anything down that you feel like you could improve upon or that you can get better at. So just a quick